to be allowed into the innermost part of the temple was a real privilege in itself. Welcome to MHA Digital Communities. I'm Bryony and I'm the Collections Officer at Macclesfield Museums. Now, in front of me, I have the mummy case of a woman called Shebnut, and this is one of the earliest objects to enter the collection at Macclesfield. Now, this was collected by Marianne Brocklehurst on her first trip to Egypt in 1873-1874. And actually, it was in March of 1874 that she bought this object from some dealers in Luxor on her return journey up the Nile. Now, when she first saw the mummy case, it was inside a larger case, and it also contained the body of the ancient Egyptian who had been buried within it. So Marianne decided not to buy the larger case that the mummy case was in, because it was too large to transport. But it's interesting because this is quite a typical style of coffin from around the 22nd dynasty, which is about 3,000 years ago. And you can see that it's very brightly painted, and quite often people remark who come to the museum on how brightly the colours still are on this mummy case that's so old. Now, the interesting thing about this mummy case is that you can see actually between the feet of the mummy case that there is a hieroglyphic inscription, and that lets us know who this mummy case belonged to and what their job title was. Now, Marianne was particularly interested in women in ancient Egypt. She collected a lot of things to do with queens and female temple singers. And it's interesting that this, probably the star of her collection, was also a woman. Now, she was called Shebnut, and she was a singer in the interior of Amen, which is a very controversial title. No one's still quite sure what it means, but it most likely meant that she was involved in the innermost part of the temple at Luxor, and that was a very important temple in ancient Egypt, as Thebes was the sort of religious capital of Egypt. And to be allowed into the innermost part of the temple was a real privilege in itself. It wasn't until around the time that Shebnut was alive in the Third Intermediate period that women had bigger roles to play within the temple. Now, this was because prior to the Third Intermediate period, the head of the temple was a man who was the high priest of Amen. But that changed as he was replaced by the god's wife of Amen as the head of the temple. Now, it's easy to diminish the idea of being head of the temple, but really it also meant that you were essentially the ruler of Thebes, which was a really important city. And as a singer of the interior of Amen, Shebnut would have worked with the god's wife of Amen, not only on the more religious side of things, so rituals and that kind of thing, but also in terms of managing the estates that the temple owned around the city. So she would have had a very important role. Now, if you look at the mummy case, it's quite short. Could mean that Shebnut was just below average height. She'd have to be a little bit shorter than average to fit inside this mummy case. Or it could be that she was a teenager or maybe even a child as young as 12. Now, if you look really closely on the sides of the mummy case, you can see that there's a band of stripes that seems to be a slightly different colour to the rest of the decoration. And that is where Marianne and Mary sawed open the case in order to take out the human remains that were inside. And Marianne and Mary thought that by burying the body in Egypt, they were doing the best that they could for the deceased individual that they had acquired through purchasing the mummy case. So when Marianne and Mary managed to get the mummy case back to England and back to their home in Macclesfield, they decided to do a lot of research into the mummy case. They wanted to find out more about the person that they left behind in Egypt and whose mummy case they now had basically in their front room. So they got in touch with people at the British Museum. They got in touch with Dr. Birch, who was like the leading authority on ancient Egypt and particularly hieroglyphs at the time. And they wrote backwards and forwards between each other all of this information that they were learning about the mummy case. And all of this work with Dr. Birch and other Egyptologists that they made the acquaintance of fed into the labels that they wrote when they put the mummy case on display in the initial exhibition at West Park Museum when Marianne's museum opened in 1898. And from there it came to here, and from that day in 1898 when the museum first opened, the mummy case of Shebmut has been one of the star attractions that we have here in Macclesfield.